This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. On this episode, we're discussing changing views of plants in 19th century America and how writers used literature to explore and shape those views. In 1866, poet Emily Dickinson, from her home in Amherst, Massachusetts, wrote to friends, quote, "My flowers are near and foreign, and I have but to cross the floor to stand in the spice aisles," unquote. A 21st century listener might take for granted the idea that plants that originated across the globe could be available in one's home. But the 19th century poet still found this remarkable. By the early 19th century, as trade and imperial conquest expanded countries' reach, there was increasing interest in transporting plants across the globe. But many live plants were fragile and didn't survive the lengthy journeys by land or sea. London physician Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward began to experiment with growing plants in glass cases, which protected them from the terrible air pollution in London. And within a few years, he had a thriving garden under glass, what journalist John Claudius Loudon described in 1834 as, quote, "the most extraordinary city garden we have ever beheld," unquote. Within a few years, the so-called Wardian cases were in wide use, transporting live plants on long ocean voyages. In 1840, the privately held Kew Gardens in southwest London became a national botanic garden and a center for scientific research. Now under the direction of Sir William Hooker, the gardens were opened to the public. A year later, Sir William's son, Joseph, a future director of Kew himself, used Wardian cases to successfully bring plants from the Falklands to Kew for public display. In the late 1840s, Scottish botanist Robert Fortune used Wardian cases to smuggle 20,000 tea plants from China to British India, where the Chinese variety of Camellia sinensis is still used in Darjeeling tea. Across the Atlantic, the revolution in global plant availability captivated the attention of 19th century Americans. In 1829, a teacher in Troy, New York, Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps, published her first textbook, titled Familiar Lectures on Botany. The book, written to be accessible for beginners, encouraged students, especially young women, to learn about the natural world around them. Familiar Lectures on Botany was wildly popular, going through 28 editions. One young woman who learned from Elmira Phelps's textbook was Emily Dickinson, born in Massachusetts in 1830, who attended Amherst Academy from 1840 to 1847, where, along with subjects like Latin, philosophy, and geology, students learned about botany. As a teenager, Dickinson assembled an herbarium, pressing 424 specimens of dried plants into an album, each plant accompanied by its scientific name, handwritten by Dickinson. Fittingly, in Dickinson's own copy of Familiar Lectures on Botany, is a dried flower pressed in between the pages by Dickinson. For Dickinson, a keen gardener, the language of plants suffuses her poetry, as in this verse from 1859. Flowers, well, if anybody, can the ecstasy define, half a transport, half a trouble, with which flowers humble men. Anybody finds the fountain from which floods so contraflow, I will give him all the daisies which on the hillside blow. Too much pathos in their faces for a simple breast like mine. Butterflies from St. Domingo cruising round the purple line have a system of aesthetics far superior to mine. Another New England gardener, whose plant imagery abounds in her writing, is abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe. Born in Connecticut in 1811. Like Dickinson, Stowe pressed dried flowers into books. She also created floral paintings, some of which can still be seen in the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Stowe, with a keen eye for plants, understood the importance of botanical accuracy in her symbolism. When landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted returned from a tour of the American South in 1856, Stowe wrote to him, asking for details. Quote, "Of what species is the pine of which you make so great mention, and of which the greater part of the pine forests are composed? Are the mosses and flowers which grow under them of the same species that grow in the pine forests in the northern states? It is absolutely necessary for me to get a perfect, definite idea of the country where I suppose the scene will be laid, and in conversing with you, I could do it." Unquote. Fellow New Englander Nathaniel Hawthorne, born in Massachusetts in 1804, developed a love of nature as a child while living with relatives in the wilds of Raymond, Maine. He later wrote, quote, "Those were delightful days, for that part of the country was wild then, with only scattered clearings and 9/10 of it primeval woods." Unquote. Even after returning to Massachusetts for schooling and longing for the freedom of Maine, Hawthorne was surrounded by nature. His uncle, Robert Manning, with whom he lived, was a founding member of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Hawthorne's writing often plays with the tensions between the wilderness of nature and human attempts at order. As he wrote in 1837, quote, "A person to spend all his life and splendid talents in trying to achieve something naturally impossible, as to make a conquest over nature." Unquote. It was not only native New Englanders who were captivated by plant life. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery in Maryland in 1818, also understood this tension between humans and plants. He witnessed enslaved people who worked the land, growing crops for plantation owners, who then denied the food from those crops to the very people who had grown them. In 1849, after he had escaped slavery, Douglass wrote in the North Star about growing pumpkins, saying, quote, "It is not so much the good quality of pumpkins to which we should call attention, as to the good moral we have extracted from them. The ground was prepared, seed sown, and the plant cultivated by our own colored hands. And although the soil is American, I took no offense on account of our color, but yielded a generous return for our industry. From this, we infer that the earth has no prejudice against color, and that nature is no respecter of persons. It pours its treasures as liberally into the lap of colored industry as into that of white husbandsmen. The earth is a preacher of righteousness. It inculcates justice, love, and mercy, repudiates the fractious distinctions of pride and prejudice, and owns all the sons and daughters of men, without regard to color, as its own dear children." Unquote. At the end of his life, Douglass lived in the Anacostia neighborhood of D.C., in a mansion he named Cedar Hill for the cedar trees on the property. At Cedar Hill, Douglass gardened extensively, and like Dickinson and Stowe, pressed floral specimens into books. Joining me in this episode to discuss the changing views of plants in the 19th century and the literary explorations of them is Dr. Mary Kuhn, Assistant Professor of English at the University of Virginia, and author of The Garden Politic: Global Plants and Botanical Nationalism in 19th Century America.
Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens with little snow white feet. She bid me to take love easy as the leaves grow on the tree. But I, being young and foolish, with her would not agree.
Hi, Mary. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start by asking just a little bit about how you got interested in the notion of plant studies and literature, how you came to this topic.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are always so many ways to answer a question like that. One answer is that I grew up right in front of a swamp that separated my parents' house from the regional high school. And I spent a lot of time out there as a little kid. And so I've always been interested in, and I worked in backcountry huts during the summers of my college job. So I've always really been interested in spending time in and among sort of planty spaces and worlds. And when I got to graduate school, I knew I was interested in ideas of place. And I started, while I was reading for coursework, I started seeing plants pop up everywhere. And I got really interested in domestic fiction, which is a really popular genre in the mid-19th century. And there was so much plant life in this domestic fiction. And, at one point, Hawthorne talks about plants as part of the family. And I got really interested. What does it mean for plants to be part of the family? How do we think about our relationship to plants, that are not just out and about in the world, but part of our homes, some things that we relate to in the everyday and the ordinary. And as I started to do research, I discovered that the 19th century, there's just this efflorescence of botanical interest. There are kind of these horticultural crazes, or all of these changes in technology that change access to plants. And so there's a lot shifting in this period that makes it really interesting to sort of think about plant life. And when I started thinking about this project back in, I entered grad school in 2007, animal studies was, a field, and Harriet Ritvo was at MIT, someone who's done amazing work in animal studies. And there wasn't a lot on the study of plants, or the conversations about plants in domestic literature were largely focused on sexuality and gender, which is a huge part of the story. But there wasn't a lot of conversation about the kind of political dimensions of these plants, which the history of science and environmental history has really uncovered and talked really deeply about the ways in which plants mobilized imperial reach, and were the objects of imperial desire, right? So cinchona becomes this tool for empires to, extend their reach, and very coveted as such, And so I was thinking, how do these two things relate to one another? The history of plants as political objects, in terms of, the history of bioprospecting, and also the history of plantation slavery, and these plants that people are encountering in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I realized as I was reading your book, I read a lot of currently written, so contemporary mystery novels about the 19th century, especially in England, but some in America too. And I realized how often plants show up in those stories, in poisons that they're doing, or the murder happens in Kew Gardens or something, and it really does, even looking back, show up a ton. So that was really interesting.
It's amazing when you start paying attention to it. I mean, I think that was a really fun part of the project. I was like, it's everywhere. And across all these different genres. And I mean, when you get into the 20th century and science fiction, I mean, there's all this, the Day of the Triffids. And I mean, you get all of this really incredible sort of, imaginative work on plant agency and consciousness. And one of the cool things that I discovered doing the research for this is that, a lot of the conversations about plant animacy and intelligence today, like there's a 19th century analog to that, which was really cool to see playing out across periodicals. And yeah.
So what are some of the technological things happening in the 19th century that really changed the game a lot, and these authors that we're going to talk about are really reacting to?
So, I mean, one thing is the invention of the Wardian case, which is a glass box essentially that allows for you to ship a plant and have it stay alive, because it can live on the deck of a ship and get the sun that way, but it's protected from the salt water, the kind of corrosive effects of salt water. And this really revolutionizes the number of plants that are able to take long oceanic journeys. So whereas there was a very slim survival rate for plants, in previous versions of kind of wooden boxes packed away, suddenly you have a lot more plants able to make it these like long distances. So that's one big shift. Another is shift in greenhouse technology, the ability to like iron hinge sash bars that let you kind of raise and lower the roof of the glass. So and then you have places like Kew Gardens that become these centers where people can come and basically, in the Palm House, you can go up a spiral staircase and then stare down at the kind of imperial bounty. So there's this way that Kew becomes a kind of organic, and I'll put that in heavy quotation marks, symbol of the kind of the reach of the British Empire, and the naturalness of that. There's just kind of like, oh, look, isn't this amazing and natural? And so that's a big shift as well. Another shift is that there's the development of horticultural societies in the US. So it becomes really a sort of middle class. It becomes more accessible to the middle class to both have things like greenhouses, like Dickinson has a hothouse attached to the side of the house. I grew up in Amherst. It was not there when I was growing up, but they've since they did an archaeological dig beneath it to make sure they weren't going to erect a replacement over something archaeologically interesting, and then they put it back up about 5 years ago, I think. So suddenly, that's something that is accessible to the middle class, not just to sort of see these plants, that are from other climates, in a greenhouse in New York or London, but to see them growing in your own home. So, and at places like Kew, there are actually tunnels running coal underneath the Palm House to heat the Palm House, and then another tunnel that's basically funneling the smoke away so that aesthetically it kind of looks like there's no labor or input to this magical system. And then seed catalogs are this other, suddenly you have all these access to all these seeds. And seed catalogs are telling you where these things are originally from. And originally from, again, is in quotation marks, because that's kind of a conjecture, and plants are found all over the globe, but there's a real fascination in, oh, this came from Australia, or this came from this particular mountain region. So Rebecca Solnit talks about photography and other technologies that kind of annihilate space and time. And the greenhouse and the seed catalog kind of function in that same way, so that someone like Dickinson can say, I only have to cross the floor to stand in the spice aisles. Might not be exactly what the right quote, but it's something like that. So that idea of these other geographies being somehow rendered material in some way to the imagination through the cultivation of plants at home.
Mm-hmm. So then you mentioned earlier domestic literature. So you find these authors within the U.S., and of course you're writing about a lot, but you have sort of 5 main authors that you're talking about in your book. How did you choose the people you wanted to write about, the text of theirs? A lot of them have enormous catalogs, but how did you hone in on what you wanted to look at to do this analysis?
I mean, I think one of the things that was kind of fun to discover is that a lot of popular writers in the 19th century were gardeners, were passionate gardeners. So, Stowe was a prolific gardener by all accounts. She's writing newspaper articles about the garden. And for her, it became really noticeable reading her second big abolitionist novel, Dread, that plants are just everywhere in that novel, and become, her thinking about modes of ecological relation is something that she mobilizes towards abolitionist ends. And so I really just got interested in authors who were gardeners. So Hawthorne is the nephew of one of the 19th century's most famous pomologists. And so he has this sort of incredible window through his uncle into some of these horticultural experiments. And he also was, experimenting in his own garden and, complaining about things that, garden failures. And it was interesting there too, to see the kind of overlap, or the way that crosses over into some of the botanical figuration in his stories. So the rose bush by the prison door and the scarlet letter, and the hothouse flower that Zenobia wears in her hair in the Blithedale Romance. And it's all over the House of Seven Gables, Alice's posy, which is growing out of the roof of the house. And, there's some horticultural pinchin who had buried some seeds away. I mean, it's all over some of these texts. So in reading the works of these authors, it just becomes really ubiquitous. And Douglass, too, his wife was, by all account, really his first wife, Anna Murray, was by all accounts really like the prolific gardener in the household. But at Cedar Hill, late in his life, he was growing strawberries. He had a peach orchard in Rochester. And Rochester was this center of sort of horticultural innovation also. And so James Vick, who becomes a sort of, he edits the Horticulturalist and also has one of the most widely read seed catalogs. He's a early supporter of Frederick Douglass's paper. So there are all of these sort of modes of crossover, and Lydia Mariah Child, who's the first chapter of the book, her husband does an experiment with ultimately unsuccessful experiment with beet sugar farming in Western Massachusetts as an alternative to cane sugar, and the sort of plantation labor associated with that. And Dickinson, as I mentioned before, was, a sort of incredible gardener. And she's receiving these cuttings from friends who are missionary wives in Syria. She gets cuttings from India, Germany, various places. These are all in her herbarium. So the choice of authors was really guided by the fact that they both were authors and gardeners, and that those identities were really linked.
So I want to ask a little bit about method. I interview a lot of historians, and so, I think people understand sort of going into archives and stuff. I want to talk a little bit about when you're writing about authors who've been read a lot, there's a lot of secondary literature about someone like Hawthorne, of course. How do you sort of take everything that is known about these people, secondary literature and stuff, and then use your own reading of a text and your own mode of analysis and your own lens through which you're looking at this. Just a little bit about kind of how you do that, what your approach is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm married to a historian, so I think I hear a lot about historical methods, and I also, when I was sort of figuring this project out, I realized that the history was incredibly important to to telling the story. That to understand how these authors are engaging with plants, I needed to understand things about developments in horticultural technology and, gardening practices and how they transform over the course of the 19th century. So, I did a lot of secondary reading was, reading the works, the literary critical works, and then a lot of reading of histories of science, environmental histories, and then spending time at places like Kew Gardens and the British Library and various sites in the US. So doing some of that kind of archival reach, but then also thinking about what kind of lens can literature, or what kind of insights can literature offer, or how does literature engage with history, in certain ways. How did Hawthorne famously uses historical fiction or to kind of engage with contemporary issues for him. And so I'm not sure this is sort of like, I feel like method is an ever evolving question, but sort of trying to figure out what does it mean, for instance, that in 1824 Lydia Maria Child is writing a book that ends with a Native American man as a gardener standing outside the nation, which is described as a mighty tree. So the gardener figure, but being excluded, and sort of thinking about, okay, what's the kind of story that she's telling here? How does this relate to what's happening in terms of with various laws? I guess like your own reading, it's a kind of back and forth between reading the story and thinking about what are the historical things that might be shaping what the individual is saying. So, I mean, again, that's kind of a new historicist approach, I guess, to kind of think about how is this plot line being shaped by things that we know are going on at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things, of course, going on at the moment in the 19th century is this desire to impose order on everything and to sort of systematize everything, understand everything. And of course, nature doesn't always want to respond to that. Nature is wild, but they're trying to do this through things like their gardening. So can you talk a little bit about, in the authors you're looking at, this tension that plays out, the wanting to impose order versus nature being wild?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of Hawthorne with this because he seems really bothered by by failure. And I think one of the things to sort of think about in terms of domestic gardening, I guess, is how much failure was a part of the story. And it's not a part of the story that's often, celebrated or put forward, because what's being put forward is like, look at this amazing, camellia bouquet that I was able to harvest, the successes, right? But that the actual experience of living with plants was, one of like, there are pests, there are frosts, things fail to thrive. You don't know why. And so I think in the home sphere, there is this attempt to kind of cultivate plants in terms of an orderliness, and all of the rhetoric around this is, there's a rhetoric of cultivation that extends to, human education as well. So the idea that like cultivate your garden and you are cultivating good morals and you're cultivating a good, a keen sensibility. It's one of the reasons why botany is celebrated for women in the late 1820s and 1830s, as sort of botany becomes part of the curriculum at women's educational institutions, is that it is, there is this sense of orderliness, and that will translate into domestic orderliness and good morals. And yet there is constantly a sense of things not working out and people having to kind of adapt. And then there are also the ways in which plants themselves challenge these categories. So one of the things that people cannot really determine in the mid-19th century is like, where does the animal end and the vegetable begin? So Edward Hitchcock gives a lecture, like one of his lectures on botany at Amherst College is basically, ruminating. Part of the lecture is ruminating on this question of like, we don't really know where the animal ends and the plant begins. And so, there is constantly, and this is a point that Harriet Ritvogen makes in The Platypus and the Mermaid, like the more you try to impose taxonomic order, you discover plants or animals or things that challenge those efforts to impose order. And so that was a really interesting thread of this story. And there's this 19th century text by a French author, XV called Picciola, about this man who makes an attempt on Napoleon's life, which doesn't end well. So he ends up in prison, and he is there's this redemption arc where he falls in love with this plant growing up through the cracks in his prison courtyard. And he becomes totally obsessed with keeping this thing alive. And the sort of climax of the book is when the plant has gotten so big that it's threatening to be, it's outgrown the little crack. And so the daughter of another prisoner is like, I will ride to Napoleon on your behalf and, plead for them to sort of help save your plant. And so there are all these, moments of people thinking through the challenges of what does it mean to keep this other form of life alive, and the kind of challenges of that, both the kind of intimacy of these experiences and just the sense of not being able to communicate with this other form of life and the kind of guesswork involved.
Yeah. Another theme, of course, in the 19th century, especially in the United States, is racism and slavery. And there are lots of moments where people are seeming to use plant life as an analog for race in various ways that you outline. And then also several of the writers that you talk about are using botany to think through slavery. And, I think it reminded me a little bit of the way that people use the Bible, right? Like you could use the Bible to support this side, or you could use it to support this side. That really you could use this idea of plants, of horticulture in various arguments that you wanted to make. But the authors that you're looking at, what are they doing here? How are they thinking through these ideas of race and of slavery?
Yeah, so the answer is there are many, many different ways. Back to your question about sort of categorization, one thing that there's, the great chain of being and ideas of sort of hierarchies of being. And one thing that happens with plants, ideas of plants as being animate or sensitive, suddenly challenges the idea that it's passive life. And so then you have a sort of sense of, authors saying, well, can we use this to kind of push on other hierarchies of life in the 19th century and constructions of life? And that's one way that someone like Stowe is trying to kind of think through these categorizations of life and push back against ideas of racial hierarchy. Another thing, that you see is gardening and the kind of care practices of taking care of plants. Various authors use that to push back against plantation slavery and plantations. So one thing that happens across the 19th century is there's a lot of soil exhaustion in the South. And Kristen Ellis has written a really good article about the way that Douglass, mobilizes that as an abolitionist argument. But one of the sort of interesting things that happens is that you have something like scientific agriculture emerge across this time with ideas of, chemical applications to soil to rejuvenate them, that is used to very different political ends in the North and in the South. So Southern periodicals, across the middle of the 19th century are thinking about how do we horticulturally innovate to sustain this system, right? And so someone like Douglass, I think, as an editor of several newspapers, is paying attention to that and also paying attention to what are the other ways that we might imagine an agricultural system that does not depend on slavery. So the kind of mobilization of different imaginations of how agriculture. So there's a good article by Jennifer James that I think it's called Buried in Guano, where she talks about how the history of guano applications and how that is used to divergent ends in the North and South as well.
Yeah, I was thinking through too. It's so interesting, this idea that in slavery society and plantation society, the people who are working the land, who in some ways must have the most expertise about what is working, are not the people who are empowered to make decisions, and are not the people who are benefiting from the land either. I think you talk about some of that tension as well, I think, but I think it really challenges some of these notions of what can we do to get ourselves out of this problem of, soil depletion or something. Well, there are people who are experts right here that you're not talking to about the ways, and of course, who would have no incentive to continue the system of slavery.
And there are small garden plots, so like Douglas's grandmother is growing food that she's selling, and she's helping other people with their own cultivation. So there were frequently, near large plantations, there were small garden plots that where enslaved people grew food, medicine for themselves, family, friends, and there's less of an archival record of these sites of expertise. But, thinking again about other spaces of cultivation that exist alongside these spaces of extraction, I think is a really, really important part of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that animal studies was a growing field, and plant studies is not gotten the same sort of attention. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is that, and why plant studies is important, and but perhaps will and should get more attention?
And I think that one thing that's been really exciting is that there's been a real burgeoning of interest in plants. So books like Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, The Overstory by Richard Powers. Then, there are books like The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Verleben. And, those are just a couple, but I know like Radiolab did a Smarty Plants episode. Like there's Michael Pollan wrote an article in the New Yorker that came out when I was in grad school called I think it's called The Intelligent Plant. There's been a sort of shift back to thinking about these questions of plants as animate. So I think some of that has to do with received ideas of plants as passive matter to be subject to, our own whims, modes of meaning making. And so plant studies, there's been a sort of rise in conversations about thinking about like actually plants are everywhere. They're everywhere in the literature, and they're everywhere in our lives. I've been, really interested with the pandemic, how much, like if you look at the numbers of plants sold, like houseplants sold during the pandemic, it's skyrocketed, right? And thinking about gardening practices in the pandemic, I think is I don't think the pandemic is what caused this shift to plant studies, but I do think, that there's been just more attention recently returned back to plants. And I think the climate crisis also has something to do with that. I mean, reading about shifts in, when I grew up in Western Massachusetts and, I went maple sugaring, and a lot of the sugaring is shifted north as climate has shifted. So I think, plant studies, I think in general, there's been a shift towards thinking about multi-species. How do you tell a story that is not just about plants or not just about animals, but also about microbes and viruses? If you're thinking about the pandemic, that to really tell a sort of complete history of what's happening. I mean, this is, again, I think a lesson from environmental history. You have to think about agents that are non-human and, non-human more than human, and think differently about, modes of relation and the modes of relation that have kind of led us to our current moment as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenge of the language you're using, though? You talk some in your book about that, you don't want to fall in the trap of anthropomorphic language, but what do you use then? So what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that's something that has sort of long interested me, is what happens when you run up against the limits of language. I mean, and this is a very literary question, right? It's why I think poetry can be so powerful at kind of thinking through these ideas of, how do you explain life lived otherwise, that you don't have, full understanding of, and there's been really interesting recent work. Hope Jelen, who wrote Lab Girl, so it kind of says, like, don't try to compare plants to us, because that reduces them in a certain way. Like, it reduces the complexity of the way that they live. And so there's this real, I think, effort to sort of also acknowledge what we don't know about plants. And so thinking about, there's a lot of, I mean, these are loaded terms, talking about plant consciousness, plant intelligence. But I think it's really productive to interrogate, well, what do we mean when we deploy these terms? What kind of associations come with them, and how do those associations and ideas lead us to sort of think about the assumptions that we make in our daily lives? So I think language can be a really useful way into these questions of, what kind of assumptions do I make through the kind of habitual language that I reach for, and how does drawing attention to some of these words actually help us think about relation differently? And again, I think this is something that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in a chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about learning the language of animacy, where she says in Potawatomi, you can be a bay, that animacy is inherent in a lot, in a mountain, in a bay, in things that English calls it, and treats as a passive object. So that grammar is a way of, this is her point, grammar is a mode of relation. And so how can we call attention to that, to again, think about and interrogate our relationships?
So if people would like to read your book, how can they get a copy?
You can order it from your local bookstore, is probably the best way, or the NYU website, or I think it's available on, Amazon and all of those other interweb spaces as well.
Well, Mary, thank you so much. This was a fun book and a fun conversation.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really, really appreciate it.
Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens with little snow white feet. She bid me to take love easy, as the leaves grow on the tree. But I, being young and foolish, with her would not agree. With her would not agree.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!
MSW